As I begin to preach this afternoon, I really hope that all of you were attentive to Father's homily and took his words to heart, so that as my preaching delays the end of Mass a little bit, you might not grow angry, but might look on me with mercy and forgiveness. Forgiveness, of course, is the subject of the gospel today, and Jesus teaches about forgiveness by means of a parable. And the central point of the parable is that it is necessary to forgive. But that's not all that we can learn from the parable. Because if we look at the details of the parable, we can learn not just that we ought to forgive, but why we should forgive. For instance, our translation says that the servant who represents us owed the master who represents God a huge amount. Well, the original Greek gives a specific amount. It says 10,000 talents. And I don't know how familiar all of you are with ancient Greek monetary values, but in today's terms, that's $10.5 billion. Billion, with a B. And that's a lot of money, but it's also a beautiful sign of God's generous love for us. We've received so many good things from God. Our health, our life, our family, and our friends. And these things are worth so much more than $10.5 billion. And so this is a beautiful sign of God's generous love for us. And in light of God's generosity towards us, how could we not forgive our brothers? The parable, it also tells us what will happen to us if we don't forgive. The ungrateful servant is tortured by his lack of forgiveness, which teaches us that seeking vengeance and holding grudges, it causes us to suffer. Intemperate anger, it robs us of the ability to enjoy God's gifts, our life, our health, our family, and our friends, and it leaves us obsessed with getting even with the one who hurt us. Vengeance, it locks us into relationships of opposition and competition, and that's no way for a human to live. So those are two details from the parable that support the message of the parable and also teach us about reality. However, there's elements of the parable that, even though they support the message of the parable, they're not in line with what we believe about reality. For instance, in the parable, the master represents God, and when the master hears that the vengeful servant doesn't forgive, the master hands the vengeful servant over to the torturers. So the master represents God, and the master tortures the person who is unwilling to forgive. That makes me wonder, is our God one who tortures? Is it God who torments the elderly parent who is bitter that their adult child never visits them? Does God seek to harm the athlete who nurtures a grudge against the team that cheated? Is it God who torments the employee who remains angry at being passed over for a promotion? No. Our God is not a God who tortures. Our God is a God who saves. And so if you hold a grudge, if you cannot stop being angry, God doesn't want to torture you. God wants to save you. And what salvation does God offer to the person who can't forgive? God offers the strength to forgive and the freedom that comes from forgiveness. Saved from anger by God, the athlete who lost due to cheating can enjoy their sport instead of counting the loss. Saved from resentment by God, the elderly parent can be generous and loving when their adult child infrequently visits them. And liberated from counting what is owed, the employee passed over for a raise, he can enjoy the income that he has instead of pining for all the things that he can't afford. But make no mistake, forgiveness, real forgiveness, is a fruit of grace. It's not something that we can choose for ourselves. We can't just decide to not be angry. We can't just choose to feel at peace. So then what then can we do? We can make an act of faith that what God tells us today in the gospel is true. We can make an act of faith that remaining angry and holding grudges hurts us. When anger feels righteous, when resentment fills our spirit, we can get on our knees and say, God, this anger feels right, but I believe it is killing me. God, free me from this anger. And then we must surrender our salvation into the hands of Christ, believing that we will be liberated from anger at the proper time and hoping in the ultimate liberation to occur when Christ comes again.